This is your Wednesday daily delivery. I am Michael Rand. So happy to have you along with me for the ride today. Got a lot to get to today. Chet Holmgren, former Minnehaha Academy star, Gonzaga star, had a big summer league debut for Oklahoma City. 23 points, 6 blocks, a big dunk. So want to talk about him a little bit and his potential rise in the NBA. Kevin Fiala, former Wild Wing, spoke with the media on Tuesday. Want to get into a little bit of what he had to say. He's joining his new team, obviously the Los Angeles Kings, after last week's trade. I'll have more on that on Thursday's show as well, with Sarah McClellan, Wild beat writer. She's expected to be on Thursday's show to talk about a little bit more about that trade, but also to set up the NHL draft, which will be Thursday and Friday. So a little bit more on that, but we'll talk a little bit of Kevin Fiala on today's show because he was a really important member of this team, but also one who maybe saw the writing on the wall in terms of what his long-term future was with the Wild because of some of those salary cap constraints. Chris Hine, Timberwolves beat writer, will be with me on today's show to further break down not just the Rudy Gobert trade and who won, who lost, hot takes, grades, but kind of where does this all kind of fit into the master plan of the Timberwolves? What was some of the what are some of the reasons they might have been interested in making this deal at this time? How does Rudy Gobert fit? How does Karl-Anthony Towns adapt to being a power forward now? How does Chris Finch adapt to having a different style of player in Rudy Gobert? And what ultimately, how will we ultimately judge success or failure in this trade? So Chris and I will get into that quite a bit on today's show as well. But first, what did I miss? I want to spend a little bit of time here on the Twins. I know Patrick Royce and I talked quite a bit of Twins on Tuesday's show, the first show back after the long break, and there'd been a lot to catch up on with the Twins. They'd blown so many games against Cleveland in that stretch. Emilio Pagan figuring front and center in a lot of those games. A frustrating stretch. The Twins, fell back, into Cleveland caught them in the division race. Looked like, hey, maybe this just isn't going to be their year. The sky is falling. Guys, guess what? The sky, in fact, was not falling. Twins now 4.5 games up again in first place in the American League Central. Now, part of that is because the Central just is not very good. A lot of other teams struggling. The Twins taking care of the Chicago White Sox for the second consecutive night. The White Sox, presumably the by most accounts, the preseason favorite to win the division. They have not been able to get it together this year, not executing on a lot of phases of the game. That triple play that Royce and I talked about Tuesday, unbelievable. This one was a little bit more cut and dried. Twins win this one 8-2. They get 5 home runs, 2 opposite field, left center home runs from Alex Kirilloff, home runs from Max Kepler, Jorge Polanco, and Jose Miranda. Josh Winder gives them a good start, replacing Chris Archer, who's on the injured list, and things just keep on rolling for the Twins. 6-4 in their last 10 games, even with those hiccups. And like I said, 4.5 up on Cleveland, 6.5 up on the White Sox now. And, I referenced this with Royce on the show the other day. I got like 3 or 4 emails while I was off last week. People understandably upset about some of those games against Cleveland. I mean, imagine if they hadn't blown at least a couple of those games, this division lead would be sky high instead of 4.5. But it does feel like that's a little bit more comfortable than you imagine it might have been given how last week went. But a lot of negativity last week. I'm not getting the positive emails right now, by the way. Funny how that works. When the Twins win, nobody rushes to say, wow, what a great team. But here was one of the emails I dug out from from a reader listener last week. Said, when are you sports writers going to point out how incompetent Mr. Dumb Deli is? Ouch. Name calling in the first paragraph. Won't go on and on, but let's look at the last Cleveland game. Use up Duffy and Moran. Okay, so bullpen this, bullpen that. This has been going on all year. Why can some players play every day but no one else? Rocco doesn't know how to put out a game lineup that makes sense. His in-game moves are a joke. He doesn't know how to manage the pitching staff, take starters out too early, and whines that his bullpen is overworked. If it wasn't for Billy Gardner, I'd say he's the worst manager the Twins have ever had. Okay, so people were definitely upset, frustrated last week, but you know what? I've talked about this before on the show. Rocco Baldelli might frustrate you. He frustrates me sometimes. He frustrates Patrick Royce more than he probably frustrates me. If you are a fan of a certain generation, watching starting pitchers get hooked after 5 innings and 70 pitches probably frustrates you to no end. It's a new way of thinking. It's not just Rocco Baldelli's way of thinking. It is a Twins organizational way of thinking. But you know what? It has been effective. This is the 3rd out of 4 years that Rocco Baldelli has been manager that the Twins are have either won the division or are winning the division. Last year was, at this point, last year looks like the outlier. This doesn't look like the outlier. Last year looks like the outlier. I did not have confidence in this team coming into this season. I did not think this was a very good team. Didn't see how it was all going to come together. Didn't think the moves they made were going to add up to all that much success. But when you look at it now, when you look at it, you say, everywhere I look, I'm seeing a lot of really positive things, Rocco said after Tuesday night's game. And you know what? He's right. Look at this. Just look at the stats. I mean, look at the way they're playing. Twins are 8th in home runs this season. They're 8th in team batting average, 7th in OPS. I mean, they're scoring plenty of runs. How many runs do they score? They're way up there in runs. They're 10th in runs scored. They're just fine there pitching. Look at this. They're 6th in team ERA. I know you guys want to gripe about how much they use the bullpen versus the starters. I know that it's frustrating sometimes when a pitcher gets a quick hook, but it is by and large working. Does it seem like smartest guy in the room stuff sometimes? Yeah, it does. It's frustrating. I get it, but it also has been very, very effective. So I want everybody to take a collective deep breath and just say, okay, all right, Twins, 47-37. They let some games get away. They won some games they maybe shouldn't have. That game, the game against the White Sox on the 4th is probably a great example. They're, tie game. They get a miracle triple play when Chicago runs themselves out of an inning. That could have been a disaster. Instead, it's not. Twins go on to rally and win that game. Played well, but that was a flashpoint in the game where they got a huge break. There have been plenty of games this season where the Twins maybe didn't deserve to win and then did win, just like there's been games where they probably should have won and then blew the game late because of bullpen malfunction. That's baseball. That's going to happen. Maybe it's happened a little bit more than you'd like this year, but the sum total is 47-37 right now. First place by 4.5 games. And Rocco, after the game, said, "Hey, I don't think we don't feel like we've accomplished anything at this point. There's a lot of season left." That is absolutely true, but they're more than halfway into this thing now. They're in first place, even through everything that happened against Cleveland. The last 10 days, 2 weeks. They're still 4.5 games up in first place again now. This is not a good division, and I do think though that this is a decent to good Twins team. You look at everything they're doing right now, everything they have been doing is above average in baseball. So let's just take a deep breath and say, okay, maybe this is working. Maybe it's not the way I am accustomed to watching baseball, but it is being effective, and the Twins are winning.
MGM Wine and Spirits is the choice for savings, service, and a great selection of spirits, premixed cocktails, wines, and of course, ice-cold beers and hard seltzers. With over 30 locations throughout the Twin Cities and beyond, there's an MGM near you. Head to MGMWineandSpirits.com to find a convenient location in your area. Get social. Follow MGM on Facebook and Instagram for all the latest news and trends. Make great moments with MGM Wine and Spirits, your locally owned and operated choice for over 50 years. Save time, save money. Shop MGM.
Happy to be joined on Daily Delivery today by Chris Hine. Back at it. It's been a while since Chris and I talked. I think we probably talked a little bit around the draft. Chris, that seems like forever ago because trades and free agency have stolen the Timberwolves headlines. The biggest one, of course, being the Rudy Gobert trade late last week. I think I described it in a blog post Monday as they gave up a third of their rotation and half of their first round picks for the rest of the decade. But they got they got their guy, and it's a fascinating deal.
It is. It's been fascinating to watch the reaction to it, both locally, fans on social media, and nationally. Nationally, this trade couldn't have gone worse for Minnesota if you believe the national pundits out there. I haven't yet to see really one positive word from anybody nationally on what the Timberwolves did. But I think the fan base is very fired up. I think locally people are very fired up about it. So it's been interesting to kind of notice the varied reaction to this deal, depending on what your perspective is.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, from your perspective, Chris Hine, we'd heard some rumblings about this being a possibility, but as you kind of sit back and analyze what they did in kind of going all in on this move, what are your thoughts? And it surprised me, I guess, just from the standpoint that we've seen new, general managers in a lot of different sports, especially in this town, come in and take a little while to evaluate things, right? They look things over. They say, okay, here's where we're strong. Here's where we need to add, but I want to look at our roster and see how it all works together. Connolly comes in right away and makes a big headline grabbing move. Yeah,
I think, some of that is looking over the roster. Some of that is looking over the Western Conference as a whole. I think you can kind of look at this Wolves roster from last year and say it's a nice story, and it's a nice kind of upward trajectory for the franchise. But you need maybe a missing ingredient that's going to put you over the top. Now, there was all the rumblings about them being after DeJounte Murray as their next point guard, potentially. He goes to Atlanta the day before Gobert gets traded. So it's just interesting that they seem to have been in the mix for a point guard that they would have given up a lot of draft capital for, or a big man who they gave up a lot of draft capital for. And so I think everybody's curious as to what the fit will be with Karl Anthony Towns. I think it might be an easier fit with those guys than people might think, because I think Gobert does a lot of things on the defensive end that Towns doesn't do well.
Sure.
And I think on the other end of the floor, Towns does a lot of things that Gobert doesn't do. So I think it could fit decently well on both ends of the floor. Tim Connolly comes in, maybe he's itching to make a move, but I also think, potentially ownership might have been itching to make a move. That Mark Lowry and Alex Rodriguez, new owners coming in, want to make a mark, want to make a splash. We've seen that in the NBA before, and it doesn't always work out. When ownership is trying to make a splash really quickly. It's definitely a minefield if you go back and look at some of those deals. But there's this in the history of the Timberwolves franchise, this team is currently constructed has a chance to be the best team in franchise history, which you might think is hyperbole, but it's the Timberwolves we're talking about here. It's not really hyperbole.
Yeah, I mean, this is a franchise that has had one season where they advanced, into the playoffs and deep into the playoffs. That was, of course, the 2004 year that we always reference, that trip to the Western Conference Finals when, Kevin Garnett was the MVP of the league, and that was quite a good team, won 58 games. So as currently constructed, you would imagine the starting five is Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, then Jaden McDaniels at the 3, Anthony Edwards, and then D'Angelo Russell. Now, who knows how long Russell will be here exactly. You can't pay everybody, and Gobert and Towns are very expensive. Edwards will be expensive in a few years. McDaniels could be too if he continues to be the player they hope he is. Now, they've got some kind of bargains around the edges. They signed Bryn Forbes to a league minimum deal just to shoot threes. I thought the deal for Kyle Anderson was reasonable, and they got guys like Jalen Noel. playing probably elevated roles still in the, Edwards and McDaniel still on rookie contracts. But, as you think about the roster as a whole, what do you think, what is the ceiling for the next 3 to 5 years? What's the realistic aim here?
I think a realistic aim is each of those years, you're a top 4 seed in the West. You make a finals push, at least one of those years, you hope. That seems, what do you think? It seems realistic to me. But
yeah,
it's hard. It's so hard to say. It's so hard to say.
It's hard to know without seeing it together yet. But
right.
That's got to be the hope, right? You don't make this kind of move to
make
say
this move without title aspirations, right?
I don't think so, and I don't think it's. No. And you look at their starting 5. That's a really good starting 5.
It is. It's probably one. It's one of the better ones in basketball. It's just the D'Angelo Russell part of this. We'll see how he fits in going forward. They have a window here, and I wrote about this Sunday. They have a window here with Ant and Jaden on their rookie contracts still for the next 2 seasons. So, yes, Gobert's making a lot of money, but they should be able to avoid the luxury tax for the next 2 seasons. That gives you 2 seasons of time to see if this thing is working, right? And in 2 years, if it's not working, before you have to venture into the luxury tax to keep it humming, if you so choose, you can evaluate what's working and what's not, see who you might be able to deal, and figure that all out, to maybe try to avoid the tax or rebuild, whatever. So it's not like the Wolves are spending an exorbitant amount of money here in the next 2 years. They should be under the tax. Because those rookie deals are still good for the next 2 seasons. But then once Ant and Jaden get their extensions, then you're talking about, like, if they really are going to go for it, they're looking at probably a hefty luxury tax bill in the future to keep it all together if it works.
And how much of this do you think, like you said, new ownership, they want to be good, they want to be relevant, and they want to be good and they want to be relevant because these are competitive guys. Mark Lowry and Alex Rodriguez are competitive guys, but they also probably want a new arena at some point. How much do you think that kind of factors into, hey, let's go for it now, create a certain buzz around this team, a certain energy around this team to make it worth this market's while to build them something new potentially?
Yeah. I think it's definitely reasonable to think that could be in play. It's just hard to say. Did it have to be done now, this year, this very moment? Maybe not, but I think you could say that, yeah, you're setting up to try and make some sort of move in the future to keep the interest to take this franchise to the next level. And this is always how it was going to have to play out for a team like Minnesota. Like, you're not, we talk a lot about how Minnesota is not going to get, the top line free agents to come here. You have to trade for them, and you're going to have to trade for them. You're going to have to give up something in return to acquire these people, or these kind of players who make all NBA teams, who get individual accolades like Defensive Player of the Year. So you're going to have to give up something. Would it make people feel better if they didn't throw in, let's say, the 2029 draft pick?
Right.
Does that make you feel any better about the trade if that pick isn't included? You know what I mean? Right. I wonder where the line is in terms of what the draft compensation would have been. That people would have said, okay, that's enough to we should stop here. If they're winning games and they're getting to the Western Conference Finals, or they make a finals push, you're not really going to remember the draft compensation too much.
And a lot of that was because they didn't want to part with McDaniels, right? That was a big piece
Yes.
That was a big piece of that. If they would have been willing to give up McDaniels, it would have been far less draft compensation.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Yes.
Okay, so it's an interesting move all around. Now, what they shipped out, in addition to the 4 first-round picks and this year's first-round pick, 3 of the guys that they traded were, pretty heavy minutes guys, rotation guys, starters to a degree, or at least high minutes guys in Jared Vanderbilt, Patrick Beverly, and Malik Beasley. How much do you think they will miss them? I kind of have conflicting thoughts on how much they'll miss those guys.
I think they'll miss them a little bit. They'll miss Pat Bev's defensive intensity and culture setting. But you look at it and it's like he's 34 years old, I think, and on a 1-year deal. So how much is he really in your long-term plans? Jared Vanderbilt, a really nice player, I think has a good future in this league. Being a very good player on potentially contending teams with his defensive intensity, his rebounding, limited offensive potential, just given, what we saw out of him last year. I don't think the ceiling is very high offensively, but who knows how he'll develop. Rudy Gobert gives you more on that end of the floor than Jared Vanderbilt does. And as for Malik Beasley, I think maybe the guy that they might miss the most on the floor out of this trade might be Beasley, just given his prolific shooting and the fact that he came on and looked like his old self in the second half of last season after a rough first half. Losing Vanderbilt hurts, but Gobert acquiring a defensive player of the year in return helps to offset some of what you're missing out of Jared Vanderbilt. Bryn Forbes helps offset some of the loss of Beasley because he can shoot 40% from 3-point range. But I think Beasley was coming on defensively at the end of last year as well, playing major minutes. So I think of the bunch that they gave away, that he's probably the one they missed the most.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the rotation is just kind of reconfigured now, bigger role for Jalen Noel, I would imagine. And then, of course, like I mentioned, they got Kyle Anderson too, who should be able to give them minutes off the bench. But it's the Towns and Gobert pairing that's the most interesting in all of this. It's got to be. And how Towns adapts to being a 4 when he's been a center pretty much his entire career. A lot of that, I imagine, is going to be on Chris Finch to figure out how the floor gets spaced, how that all works together. And I imagine there's going to be some growing pains there. I think it works better defensively immediately than it probably does offensively. It's just going to be interesting to see how that all comes together.
It is, because how much is Karl going to play inside as opposed to playing outside on the offensive end? I still think when you have 2 guys like Towns and Gobert, I think you'll be able to figure it out. I think they will figure it out eventually. Chris Finch has experience with putting together offenses that revolve around 2 bigs. He's done it before in New Orleans with Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins. So maybe you'll see a little bit of that playbook coming out this season. Who knows? But, Gobert is one of the best screeners in the league. The stat screen assists basically exist because of him.
Right.
So, that's one way to get him on the perimeter. Maybe you get Karl down low. Who knows? But I think you're right. I think defensively, it probably clicks a little easier at first than it might offensively. But I think there's so much talent there. There's enough shooting on the floor that it'll stay spaced, because Karl himself can shoot 40% from 3-point range. We know Russell can shoot well and is a decent 3-point shooter. So, and Jaden, I think, can be okay. We'll see if he takes a jump this year with his 3-point shooting. So I think there's enough shooting on the floor for that in that starting 5 that it could work.
The doomsday scenario, of course, is that none of this works. Some sort of combination of injuries or ineffectiveness for whatever reason torpedoes this, and they end up giving up a whole bunch of unprotected lottery picks that turn into the next LeBron James. I don't think that's going to happen, but this is the Timberwolves. I mean, how worried should they be about giving up so much draft capital?
You start worrying if this doesn't work.
Yeah.
If this is working and they're winning 50 plus games a year and making deep runs in the playoffs, like I said, you're not going to worry so much about the draft picks. But if this doesn't work, I don't know how much you're going to be able to recoup down the line. Like, let's say we're 2 years out from this. They've decided it doesn't work, and now it's time to cut your losses and try to get back what you can. I don't know what they would do. Who would you pivot to trade at that point, and what could you get in return? It's just tough. That's always going to be kind of hanging over this is those draft picks and what they potentially become. It's just too hard to say. You hope that for the next 3 years, when you give up 2 of those picks, that they're going to be at least in the 20s.
Yeah.
But again, you never know. You never do know. That's the risk you take.
We'll meet Gobert on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, and that will be an interesting.
Seems that way. Yep.
An interesting introduction. It's got to change the way you think about this team. I mean, all of a sudden they go from a nice little story to this team that's really taking a big swing, and it's just kind of, where can they take it from here?
Exactly. When we're talking about Western Conference final runs and things like that, you know that it's a different day for the Minnesota Timberwolves than when this podcast started, for instance.
It really, yeah. One of the very first episodes of this podcast was after Ryan Saunders got fired, and they were like 7-24 at that point, or I don't know what their record was exactly, but it was not good. And to from there to here in about 17 months is a pretty far way to go. Well, Chris Hine, good stuff. I'm sure we'll have plenty more to chew on as time goes on, but appreciate you hopping on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Good stuff from Chris Hine as usual. One thing I just wanted to point out too is I keep going back to Tim Connolly's quote I think it was an introductory news conference where he's talking about ending possessions and how that's the most important thing, getting rebounds, finishing possessions off. And that feels like that was a big motivator in what they went into this offseason attempting to do. Denver was number 1 in defensive rebound percentage last season. That's where Tim Connolly came from. Utah, with Rudy Gobert, gobbling up the boards, was 5th in defensive rebound percentage last season. That will give you a lot of ended possessions. That's a big deal. When you need a rebound, you're going to be able to get a rebound. And that was a frustrating piece, especially in the playoffs last season, and that should not be a problem now, especially when Gobert and Towns are on the court together. So watch for that this season. Let's move on quickly. I want to talk a little bit of Kevin Fiala. He met with the media on Tuesday. Video call, said, it is what it is right now, talking about the trade that sent him from the Wild to the Kings. Just tried to win some games. So, yeah, it is what it is right now. To be honest, I'm really excited right now for this new chapter, and he should. I don't know why he'd have any hard feelings about any of this. He got a 7-year, $55.125 million deal from the Kings, and the Wild could not have afforded him, as Sarah McClellan pointed out in her story, and I'm sure we'll talk more about on Thursday's show. His new contract at average value almost $8 million is more than the Wild's current salary cap space of $6.6 million. So the numbers just weren't going to add up unless the Wild was going to trade a whole bunch of other players. That just wasn't going to make sense. So the Wild not only getting a prospect, but a first-round pick in exchange for Fiala. That to me is kind of the ideal for the Wild. I like Kevin Fiala, but getting Brock Faber, getting a first-round pick in this deal, that's kind of what you should do with the players that maybe you don't want to pay. You worry about overpaying. So I think this worked out pretty well. They got good years out of Fiala. The trade of Granlund for Fiala came out looking really good in that case. And that's just kind of the way it is. It's the nature of the business, and that's where they are right now. And I'm sure Sarah and I will talk more about that on Thursday's show. Let's finish with the cooler. Chet Holmgren, my goodness, a monster game in his summer league debut. 23 points, 6 blocks. I think he had like a laughing emoji on Twitter afterwards. 23 points, 6 blocks. He made some 3-pointers. He's 4 of 6 from 3-point range, 5 of 5 from the line, 7 of 7 from 2-point range. I mean, my goodness, this is a guy it's just summer league. It's just summer league, so it's just it's not the NBA. It's not this, not that, but that is awfully impressive for a debut. So I'm looking forward to watching more of this, just seeing how his body type, how his game translates to the NBA. And so far in summer league, so good for Chet Holmgren. That'll do it for today. Like I've mentioned a couple times, Sarah McClellan on Thursday's show. Hope you enjoyed today's work. We'll be back at it again tomorrow.